there is benefits to have some form of fractional reserve banking and some liquidity in the system, and to have this growth mindset, because we have had more prosperity than ever before in human history, because there's been abundant supply of capital and trade and all this. So yeah, there's definitely benefits to the way that the system is, but there's economically, it's just proven to be so warped. The Gini coefficient right now, which measures wealth inequality, is the worst it's ever been. So yes, we have technology and everybody's got these phones and all this. So people generally feel like the system works and it's good. But when you measure the wealth and you see how unequal the wealth concentrates to the top, it's clear that this is not beneficial to the average person. So yes, it affects our lives positively, but really it just basically makes us complacent and enslaves us while they get really, really rich, like insane rich.
So is that one of like the big reasons why you think, do you think Bitcoin is a more fair currency?
It is, because it's outside of the system and it's kind of like a resistance currency. It's first of all, like, it's free speech money. You can't stop it.
Yeah.
So if you respect privacy and free speech, then Bitcoin, you should relate with that, because they can't stop Bitcoin. They can't censor your transactions like they can with credit cards and PayPal and your bank account. You can just get your bank account shut off if you're like a political dissident or something like that. So in that way, it's totally outside of the fractional reserve system. It's not controlled by any central banks. They can't stop it, and you can't be censored. So that's pretty much it. It's more fair, and it's more from the people, by the people, for the people. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Wow. That sounds great.
And it's like a free market currency. So it's a totally capitalist system. It's a free market that you can be anybody, and you can start making Bitcoin and processing Bitcoin transactions. And it's just a good example of how a system can work without government interference and private banker interference.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought it was really interesting when I first heard about it that it's boundaryless, right? It's really like a global currency, which I think is absolutely necessary in today's day and age, with all these exchange rates where a lot of us like lose money on a lot of the time if we're traveling. You have something like Bitcoin that is just consistent.
Yeah, and it's especially felt by people that live overseas in places where they've got challenges with their economies and stuff, where the government sets this fake exchange rate with US dollars for their native currency, but the real currency is trading in the black market just by money changers on the street, and it's floating at a much different rate. So like in a lot of places their money is just broken. And even a lot of developing nations, they've skipped the wired phones and they've just gone straight to mobile phones. They don't have bank accounts, so they're starting to use their phones as bank accounts. And since Bitcoin is like a totally apolitical money, it's borderless, it's boundaryless, and it works on mobile phones. I mean, it just helps for human rights and freedom and free speech and all that stuff. So for us over here, it's not as much of an impact, the actual usage of it, as money. But
Yeah.
for most people in the world that kind of live in oppressive regimes, or even people in China where there's capital controls in China, there's billions of people in China that just can't get access to anything other than their government controlled currency. And Bitcoin is, a way for people that have to go outside of the law or outside of the normal rules. They can do it just with a mobile phone.
Yeah, it sounds like
Anyways,
I think it's super, super effective. And just to touch on that, like the underdeveloped countries that are third world countries, they really are skipping over that that transition, and they don't have those. They never had like land phones, and never had like a certain type of I don't know, like diesel or coal like fueled heating places. They just are switching over completely to electricity, and mobile phones. So yeah, that's going to be a big transition as that happens in India, Indonesia. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exciting.
It's definitely exciting. Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, we could touch on this. Millennials were the most right. Were the most likely to get this question right. About.
Oh yeah, we just talked for 10 minutes about something totally different. So the question was, who creates the dollars? So the millennials were the most likely to know that it was the Federal Reserve that created the dollars, that's interesting.
Yeah, most likely to know it. And then 46% of the wealthy got this question right. So there we go. They're finally getting something right. They know who creates the US dollars, but only
Right, there we go.
There we go. Points for them. Then we also asked what type of entity do we think the US Federal Reserve is? Again, shocking that only 15% of the people know that it's a private corporation like Federal Express. Because 70% thought it was a federal government entity like the Treasury. So that's
and only 15% thought it was an arm's length government like the CIA or the FBI. So it's interesting to know that the majority of people think that the government controls creating money.
Yeah, they really don't know. In this case, Gen Z was the most likely to get the answer right, but again, only 22% of Gen Z got it right. And then there were no significant socioeconomic factors on this.
So even though the wealthy got the answer correct, they still didn't understand that it wasn't a government entity. They thought the they know the Federal Reserve creates the money, but they thought it was just like the Treasury, just like an arm of the government.
Exactly. Yeah, they didn't actually know. And it's also, if you don't know when you read a question like this, it's absurd to think that it is a private corporation, right? That almost sounds corrupt. So
yeah, totally. That was what hooked me with Ron Paul when I first heard him speak about the Federal Reserve and the money supply and all this. I was like, that's crazy. That can't be true. And I had to start like going down the rabbit hole of who creates the money and how is this set up, and the 1913 Federal Reserve Act, and how they snuck that in at Christmas, and when most of the people were away at Christmas vacation. It was that's what hooked me on him, and then led me to Bitcoin eventually.
Yeah, I remember learning about this when I was at Harvard, and one of my professors, he was actually the chairman in charge of this other organization, which was the holding company between all of the largest banks in the U.S. Because a lot of the time they have to, they don't do it daily, right? If I'm with like CIBC and you're with RBC and I send you, $2,000. That doesn't happen instantaneously, right? The banks actually calibrate their sheets at the end of the month or at the end of whatever cycle. And he was actually the holding company that would hold the money from all of the different banks. He had trillions of dollars passing through this third party company, and of course taking a small percentage of it, but making sure that every bank got what they got, because they couldn't obviously transfer between each other, because then it's just not as safe.
Wow.
Yeah, and the other crazy thing is that he was also the place where the Federal Reserve was sending money through. So he was like a stopping point before giving it to all of the different parties.
I think they call them clearing banks, right?
Yeah, clearing banks.
Wow, that's and that guy was one of your teachers?
Yeah, he was one of my teachers. Great class.
I bet you he liked the Federal Reserve.
It sounded like he did. It sounded like the Federal Reserve made him a lot of money. Yeah, which was cool. Okay, so now we're at the section of the survey that goes into Bitcoin. Finally, so we've dealt with the stocks, financials, monetary systems, and now we're on to what people know about Bitcoin. So without Googling, who do you think controls Bitcoin? And only 35% got the answer right, which is nobody / the users. Most people thought that Bitcoin was controlled by a company.
Well, you know what's funny? It's actually good to know that more people got the answer correct about Bitcoin than they did about the Federal Reserve.
That is wild, actually. Look at that. That's a huge takeaway.
Yeah, more people natively understood that Bitcoin was not controlled by anybody that knew that the Federal Reserve was a private corporation. That wasn't a government entity.
I actually think that's a very valid insight, because I mean, for me, there has to be something like why the Federal Reserve didn't want people to know that they're a private corporation. I also feel like that's kind of like, you know, a point to be aware of. Whereas Bitcoin, you know, they're proud that it's not controlled by anybody. You know?
Exactly. Yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah, I think that's important also. Gender effects. Actually, men were more likely to know that Bitcoin was not controlled by anybody at 41% versus 28% of women. And that is, so this is actually where you see the shift happen. So even though women were quite a bit more knowledgeable and right about many of the questions about whether the dollar had gained or lost purchasing power, but here we actually see that men know quite a bit more about Bitcoin. And that can either be because of their involvement, like in gaming, like you said, but that's definitely a gender effect.
Well, it makes sense if you think about it from women being more conservative and less risk-taking, that they would understand more natively about how the money system works, because that's how, you know, a conservative thing. Everybody uses money, but Bitcoin is a bit more risky. It's kind of looked at like an early technology and a risky investment to people. So men are more likely to be taking those risks. So it makes sense that from a conservative point of view, the women would know more about money and the men would know more about Bitcoin.
Right.
Now. But as we go like through time, I bet you it'll be more like the other question. Like the women will probably, as more women get involved in Bitcoin, or as Bitcoin becomes more mainstream, it'll probably equalize back to women being smarter.
Equalize back to that. That's funny. Yeah, who knows?
I'll do the survey again in 10 years and see how that changes.
Yeah, actually, that'd be interesting. We'll get Ron Paul on board by then. And this was also a surprise. Boomers were significantly more likely to get this answer right. Nearly half of the boomers knew that Bitcoin was not controlled by anybody or the users, whereas the average was sitting at 32% for the rest of the generations. So that's quite significant also, 47 versus 32%.
That's interesting.
I know. That is interesting. Also, I think this is hilarious. The wealthy were more wrong than any other socioeconomic class. There you go. The wealthy is just not, they don't know.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, because the wealthy probably were the least exposed to that knowledge, because they were more thinking about the traditional money system, the US dollar, the stock market.
Right.
And since they got all that so wrong, it doesn't surprise me that they're not paying so much attention to Bitcoin, because they don't even realize, how the other stuff works.
Yeah, interesting.
Until they do the survey, and then they learn, and then they change their mind.
And then they'll know. Yeah. This is also interesting. So do you consider yourself knowledgeable about what Bitcoin is? And yeah, I guess we'll just start at the beginning. So 27%, no, I'm not interested. 45%, I know very little, but I want to know more. 17%, I understand it well and want to learn more. And then 11% say I'm very knowledgeable about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency. So yes, about 62% of the population wants to learn more, which is great. You know, that's 62% interest in Bitcoin, and we're at 27% of people that don't care and don't really want to learn more. So those are, the key figures for this slide. And then in terms of gender effects, which is, I think, staggering, we have very big differences between men and women here. So we have 15% of men who are like, nope, I'm not interested, but almost 40% of women are not interested. That's huge. That's 40% of an entire gender that doesn't care or expresses not caring. And then in the very knowledgeable category, you have men significantly expressing that they're significantly more knowledgeable at 18% versus 4% of women.
Wow, that is really good data, because that will help, as we publish this result, it will help people that are in this Bitcoin space, whether they're educators or whatever, maybe think about how to engage women more meaningfully, to get them interested.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree. And even showing that they are like knowledgeable and, smart, let's say, but have just not been exposed to Bitcoin in the same way that men have.